It's been a while since I uploaded a video. I'm aware of that. UE5 came out, and then 4.27 came out, and I'm managing 4 versions of the plugin right now. So it hasn't been as many new features as I was like, and more just like maintaining separate branches and patching bugs into all of the different things. But I had some people that now that the hand socket component is finished, or at least all the major features are there and it's ready for use. I had some people that are getting confused about how to use it correctly, so I thought I'd put up a quick video about how it works and general information about it. So as you can see from this ungodly pyramid of disembodied hands, I added a couple examples to this template real quick to record, and then I'll remove these because, well, the cubes don't need them. So I guess I'll go into these. Something about the BP cubes, or they are a epic template object that's been left over from there, and I was showing how to implement the interface into them manually. Which is not something that has turned out to be a good idea because people keep getting confused thinking that they're prefabs when they're not. But you can actually override closest grip slot and range, put in the default logic for it, and then add hand socket components to these as well. And these all set up so that they are match rotation, so that whichever position your hand is in when it goes to reach for them, it'll choose the closest to that and snap to that, which I'll go over in the gun. I just wanted to point out that the cube could have that. So I've set up a couple of examples here. The gun always has this primary grip. I've now added a secondary grip to show how that works, and I've added some match rotation grips onto the hand, the slider up at top here. It's too fast. There you go. At the slider up top here to show how that works. Let me, hand mat? Yeah. Let me make these somewhat translucent again. You can actually hide visualization matches on individual sockets to make it cleaner to see what you're looking at, and then just display those hand sockets whenever you want, which is nice. You can also mirror the visualization by hitting mirror visualization mesh, but it's not going to work on this component here because it's not set to mirror on it. So anyways, okay, let's go on to the gun. Now, the major thing that people have had issues with is understanding just how the hand socket component works at a base level. So I'm going to select the static mesh component, which is the gun, which is what I want a hand socket on. I'm going to add this hand socket base class that I made an editor to it. Let me pull it off so it's visible. So what was done before is this is a base class that I made of the hand socket for this template. And all it does in it is it's a child of hand socket component, and it sets this hand relative placement to a value that matches the mesh up to where the controller is, so that it's prefab to where the mesh is in the correct position to grip something. So when you want to add it to a actor, then all you have to do is pull it into the actor, align it wherever you want to align it, and that is where your static mesh hand is going to be relative to the actor then. The whole key point there is that this hand relative placement has been pre-done and pre-set up ahead of time to what you use for your hand offsets, so that this socket location is always correct. And then from then on out, it's just moving the component around to position the hand. If you want to get more advanced after that, there are a couple of things where, let's say you want to, well, actually I did it on the secondary hand here. So up on the secondary hand here, I really wanted the secondary placement to be dead center on the gun. I wanted the controller to be right in the middle of the barrel. It feels the most natural when you're aiming, but that looks terrible with the actual hand itself. So what I did for this was I placed the hand socket component here. Let me duplicate this so I don't mess up the offsets on that one before I go and play with it in editor. Okay, so I put the hand socket component so that it was dead zero on the gun there, and then I wanted the actual hand mesh to make that more visible. I wanted the actual hand mesh to be offset a little bit and off to the side. So these little green pivot here that's showing here, that's the actual socket, the actual component. But if I select this red pivot here, and it says visualizer up at the top, this is the actual visualization mesh. You can move it independently from the component. You see how the component's pivot isn't moving, but this visualization mesh is moving? So I can translate and rotate this visualization mesh entirely separate from the actual component itself. And what it does is it'll set this hand relative placement, see how the values are moving there, live for you. So while you generally want hand relative placement to always be the same because you can just translate a mesh into position, it's always correct to the controller where you want it. In the case of something like this where you want the controller dead zero because it feels better, but the hand looks terrible in that position, you can actually cheat and move the hand off to the side, rotate it into a different position, and people generally won't notice too much if there's a little bit of offset, and it'll certainly look better from a gameplay perspective. Something else even beyond that is someone requested a decouple function, where if you click this, it makes the hand relative placement into its component space instead of the relative space, and completely decouples it to where you can move the socket around, and the visualization mesh will stay in the same location. So this is especially useful if you want to tweak, how something holds in hand, but you have dialed in the perfect mesh position, perfect finger poses, whatever. You can just leave that where it is and change the actual grip location as you need to make things, a little cleaner for whatever you're doing. That was something that someone asked for. If you disable decouple mesh placement, it'll automatically recalculate hand relative placement into relative space for the component again. And if you move the socket after that, visualization mesh will move with it again. So I mean, that's the basic of how you align and move a mesh into position. Something that does help is if you are editing something, it's good to put it into a more visible mesh material. So like the secondary one I added just tonight, I posed all the fingers against it, which is the general. You grab a socket and you rotate the finger in and out of being where you want it to be. It's easier from the bottom. See how I've moved the fingers up and where they're supposed to be up against the actual gun. And I didn't get too finicky about this. I mean, template's not a game, it's just an example, so I just got it roughly good. And then it saves all those custom pose deltas. If you turn off custom pose deltas, the hand goes back to its raw base pose, which that'll let you see the difference between the raw base pose and the delted pose where I snap the fingers in. I didn't bother with these two. Again, as always, if you want to, you can save current pose and it'll create a animation asset for you that you can just reuse then. That's nothing too special there. Some of the options for this is flip for offhand. You want this enabled in this situation because it means when you grab it with your left hand, the hand will flip over to the side and be mirrored on this axis. Under advanced here, you have which axes you want things to actually mirror on. So for the gun, this is all Y forward, so everything is set up for Y forward flip on X. But you can change that on objects that are in a different axis. Something else useful that I actually used up on the slider here is one thing with slider. Let me show one of these grips. Show visualization mesh. Okay, so on a slider, you don't necessarily want to snap a grip to the slider because that'll move the slider to the position with the hand off at the base. So what I did on these grip sockets is I enabled only snap mesh, so it'll visually snap to this top slider, but in the actual grip, it's still going off the controller's actual location. So only the mesh hand moves into position here. The actual full controller grip is just where it was relative to it when it gripped. And that's useful for things like this. You'll see why in a second. Nope. I wanted to hide it. Okay. Some of the other options are slot prefixes. So this is probably not how I would have done it if from the ground up I was working with components for sockets. But considering you can still have mesh sockets, which this still has one. I still have VR Grip Secondary 1 here, which will fight with this hand socket, by the way. If you don't want it to fight, just delete that. It doesn't need to be there. but I left it in. I should probably disable it now that I have that on there. But so you still have the slot prefixes, which means you can still use systems that you'd set up previously with normal sockets where, you have VR grip primary, a VR grip primary left hand, VR grip primary right hand, where you can differentiate sockets based on which hand's gripping them or different, gameplay oriented select statements that you decide to make. So it can still use this fname prefix value to select between sockets with however you were doing it before. These are all drop in automatically with VR grip P already in them, and then you can change it to S for secondary grips. Standard normal stuff. I didn't make like a toggle. This is a secondary hand or anything because honestly the prefixes are more flexible and people have already made systems based on them, and I wanted any hand socket components to be able to be thrown into current works in progress and just work. So I didn't make any changes there on how this logic works. Going back down the options again, left hand dominant, all it does is you can see how the hand mirroring works now. Left hand dominant toggles between right hand and left hand being the mirror. So with right hand dominant, which is the default, it'll mirror if the left hand grabs the socket if your mirroring's enabled. And with left hand dominant, it'll mirror if the right hand grabs the socket if mirroring's enabled. So when you switch left and right hand dominant here, it'll actually switch sides and show the mirrored version. It's good for double checking that the offsets are good. Always in range is something I added where it'll ignore all within range of socket settings, and the socket will always be in range. So if you want a socket to always be snapped to an object regardless of where it's gripped or anything else, you can just toggle on always in range, and for this primary grip, if I grip way up at the tip here, it'll still snap to the primary grip instead of doing a normal free pose grip up here. I don't want that here because secondary, you don't really want to have a secondary always in range for this gun. Match rotation is something that I enabled up on the ones up here again. Actually, we'll show these visualization meshes. I want this one. Okay. So you see how one's oriented that way, one's oriented that way. If you have match rotation enabled, it'll pick whichever one is closest to your controller rotation at the time of grip. So it'll save out all of the sockets in range, and if multiple sockets in range have match rotation set on them, it'll sort through them by rotation as well after distance, and then it'll pick the ones closest to the controller rotation and use that. So if you were to grip with your hand on top facing that way and match rotation's on, it'll select that one. If you're off to the side gripping that way, it'll select that one. You know, I think there is room there for me to do some more logic there where if left hand versus right hand, match rotation will behave a little differently, because right now, as you see, I've layered 3 up here to match this case, that case, and that case, when I could have matched the mirror of crossed here. But I haven't decided what to do with that yet. What else is on here? Override distance, that's self-explanatory. It overrides the slot distance. So you can have per hand socket different distances if they're within range of. Mirroring is flip for offhand, so this hand, I already explained, it'll flip to that side with the left hand. And you can also do it where it only flips rotation. So this would mirror and rotation around, but it stay in the same position, which in this case would look terrible because you clip into the gun, but it has some uses every now and then. One thing of note is if you change the visualization mesh, some people have ran into where pose deltas were still enabled or something, and the mesh becomes a gigantic mess. That's just because it's saved some metadata between changing the meshes. The socket component is still trying to make sense of what it had on it. If you close out of the blueprint, or you want to turn off custom pose deltas, but then if you close out of the blueprint, open it back up, it should fix it. It's very rare that you're going to change visualization mesh, because usually that'll be in your base socket component class, which is in the example. It is under core and hand socket base, and you see how I've set the hand relative placement to a default. This matches with the pawns using the OpenXR 4.27 template, so that the hand mesh is going to be exactly relative to the grip, where the hand mesh on the pawn is relative to the controller. This is the scale on visualization mesh that it should mirror, because it depends on what orientation your hand mesh is. Um, on the pawns that I'm using the template, -Z is where the left hand is scaled on, so that's what the visualization mesh is doing. Um, Again, mirror visualization mesh is going to do the same as left hand dominant. It's going to show the mirrored version for debugging and making sure that everything's correct on either side. Okay, so I mean that's the basics of hand sockets. It takes a little bit to wrap your brain around, but once the big caveat and the big thing people keep running into is they load one in and they see hand relative placement and they're like, oh, I need to modify this, and they'll go and manually change these values and it'll screw everything up because visually the hand will be in the correct place, but the actual component, which is where your controller is gripping from, is way off and nothing works correctly. This is really intended to never be modified manually, and when it is modified, it's generally only modified by, let me duplicate this again. I don't want to mess it up right before I go in. It's generally only modified by going in and in the actual viewport setting the offset differently. You really shouldn't generally ever be manually going in and changing these values. It's kind of a waste of time to do it that way. Unless you really need, something to be tweaked by, a tenth of a millimeter or something. Other than that, I mean, once you have that hand socket base set up, it's pretty simple to get going. Another thing is if you don't provide custom pose deltas, like you notice on the slider here, how these hands are still in their default pose. I did not provide an animation. I did not use custom pose deltas, so it's not outputting any animation data for the grasping hand to use. So when the grasping hand goes to use it, it's just like, hey, I don't have an animation. So the grasping hand, being what it is just going to use its auto curling thing, and it will grip around this slider, for example, in whatever pose fits best when it auto curls in. So that's useful for that. You have the hand socket, you have the orientation, but you'll still use the auto curl on this. So you don't have to manually pose all the fingers, like was done here, where it was posed around there. So let me hop into VR. This is 4.27, so I need to get out of Blueprint previews, or the editor is going to slow down like crazy. So one second, let me get my headset on. Alright, so I'm testing Quest. Let's go into VR preview. Something people have been... shit. Well, OpenXR is a little bit of a work in progress, as people know. Give me a second. I need to... When the headset goes to sleep, it causes some problems with this sometimes. Especially if the headset goes out of linked mode with the PC in the middle of the editor session, like just happened there. It couldn't start the OpenXR process, but for some reason the OpenXR process still tries to do it. Something else is there's been people of my plugin, users of my plugin, that have been having problems where no inputs work whatsoever when they're using a linked Quest. And that for some reason turns out to be if your X button on your Oculus controller is mapped, which it is in my template, because it's what I use to swap movement modes here. Um, it won't generate the correct format for the input JSON file that gets sent to OpenXR, and so it just won't map any inputs. I've reported that to them. Hopefully that's fixed. Temporary workaround is to remap that button to anything but the X, but the Oculus controllers don't have that many buttons to begin with when you get right down to it, so it's a little sparse. Okay, so I have my primary grip here. I have that secondary grip which I added up here, and see how the hand moves into position, even though realistically my controller is here, dead center in the barrel, but it snaps the hand off to the side into a like visibly better area. But when I go to aim, my hand's dead center. It's easier to aim like, ooh, it's a little loud. It's easier to aim like that. So if I drop this gun, it goes to that hand, and my grip with here, it mirrors that hand socket to the other side for the left hand. So that's the point of the mirroring, is you don't have to put another hand socket in, you don't have to do anything, just toggle mirroring and boom, it's in the right spot. So regarding this, this is the one that chooses the correct orientation, and depending on where you oops, there we go. Depending on where you grip it, it'll let me do this with my right hand. It'll use a different hand socket. So see, it's using that one right there, and it snaps the hand socket, and the auto curl happens because I didn't give it an animation. Ooh, template. This lags a little bit streaming. I really like OpenXR, but you see how it's snapping around in a circle like that? So you get the different poses depending on which orientation the controller's in. It's not free posing it. See how it's still snapping? Because I'll go at an angle and I'll still pick one. I go a little bit more to the one side and I'll pick that one. I like OpenXR, but it is a little early. I'm not saying that everyone should use OpenXR in 4.27 because, yeah, there are still issues with it. But I chose to take my template to it because I would like it to be debugged as quickly as possible. And it's not too far out from being fully usable. So, yeah, I want to do my best to help. Anybody that wants to use the old module based and not have the new hand offsets and everything OpenXR requires can upgrade a 4.26 template to 4.27. It should cleanly upgrade, and then you shouldn't have any problems. These cubes have those different hands and different rotations on them. I didn't set them to mirror, so this is one thing. If you don't set it to mirror, see how the hand's like that? It's because it's the same offset as if it was a right hand there. If you set it to mirror, then it would mirror to here, like that. So I wanted to show what happens if you don't mirror one. Now, obviously on a cube, it's not a good thing to have, but there's some objects where you don't want to mirror. Anyways, that's the basics of the hand socket component. How to hook it up is a little different. It's kind of hard to do in a video tutorial, so I wasn't going to. It kind of depends on how you have your animations and how you run them. Um, I will load up the grasping hands real quick. The thing is, the grasping hands weren't really originally part of this, and they're still a little... Wait, where am I? Oh, testing. They're still a little out of the natural order of things. So let's do... Yeah. So here I have retrieve poses in the grasping hand, which is being called on grip in the main event graph. So on grip, this changed a little bit since people would have last seen it. I initiate the grip, it checks if it don't attach hand. If it's not don't attach hand, then retrieve poses. And retrieve poses will get the gripped object. Make sure it's a slot grip, because if it's not a slot grip, then it's not hand socket grip. And then it'll get the slot name to search for, and it'll get that hand socket component from the object. You'll get the transform that the mesh wants to sit at relative to it, and then it'll get the animation from it as a pose snapshot that you can set in the animation blueprint. Yeah, custom animation is snapshot, has custom animation. I mean, that's pretty much it for hooking it up. You would just get the hand socket object, and then however you're handling, you don't have to use the mesh relative transform. Mesh relative transform is, like I said before, if you have the mesh not in line with where it normally is in the hand socket component, and you want to tweak things slightly, then you will need to pull this and modify your hand when it attaches, or however you handle your mesh hand to be offset like this. In cases where things are attaching to your hand, you obviously can't do that. So this is more of like when the hand's attaching to other things concept. And then the blended pose snapshot is just a universal way of getting a animation out of something regardless if it was the blended custom finger posing or if it was a full animation. This just converts it to a snapshot and sends it to you, so you only have to work with one type of data. Flip hand will mirror the hand, so you can use this in full body, or if you're using a left and right hand separated mesh, then you can do this. Some people are doing that. I did convert this template over to using just a right hand mesh and then inversing it with some workarounds, so I'm not using this, but I put it in so people could. If you're using a full body mesh, then you would toggle this if it's a left hand, and it would flip the pose snapshot over to the left hand instead. rename the bones and everything. But I mean, that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, you can contact me on Discord or private message or whatever. Don't have any nightmares about this travesty. And yeah, it's a basic sand socket component. So I'll talk to you later. Bye.